welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going a lot deeper than the usual Thanksgiving story.
Right.
We're going past the turkey and the Mayflower Compact and looking at the brutal economic experiment that was the Pilgrims' first few years.
That really is the mission today. We're unpacking sources that show how those first truly miserable years were tied directly to how they managed property, or maybe how they didn't.
So this is less a survival story and more a case study.
Exactly. We're going to trace the specific, really radical changes they made that turned 3 years of near starvation into, well, decades of abundance. It's a lesson about human incentive, and it's hidden right in the middle of our biggest holiday.
And our main guide for this is the analysis of economist Sartell Prentice Jr., but he bases everything on the best possible source.
The absolute best. Governor William Bradford's own history of Plymouth Plantation. I mean, he was there. He was the leader. And he wrote down not just what happened, but his own theories on why.
It's an incredible document.
It is. And to give you a sense of what we're talking about, there's this tradition in one Pilgrim-descended family. They place 3 kernels of corn by each plate on Thanksgiving.
Just 3.
Just 3. A quiet reminder of those first years when that was often the entire daily ration. That's our starting point. That level of scarcity.
So let's set the stage. The Pilgrims were fleeing religious persecution. First England, then they went to Holland in 1608.
Right, but they were worried their children were losing their English identity.
So they looked for English soil, which led them across the Atlantic. They finally land in Plymouth Rock in, mid-December 1620?
Yeah, the absolute worst time to arrive. And the struggle began, the second they got off the boat.
And the casualty rate was just shocking.
It's brutal to read. Bradford is unflinching.
Right.
Within just 3 months, out of 100+ people, he says scarce 50 remained. Half the colony gone.
And for those who survived, it's hard to even imagine.
He writes that there were only 6 or 7 sound persons left to do everything.
Everything.
Cooking, cleaning, nursing the sick, burying the dead, day and night. Just a handful of people keeping the entire community from collapsing.
And it wasn't just the Pilgrims.
No. Half the crew of the Mayflower also died before the ship could even sail back to England that spring.
But even surviving that first winter didn't solve the real problem, which, it turns out, was famine.
That's right. Fast forward to the spring of 1623. Bradford's description is just horrifying. He wrote, "All their victuals were spenta, and they were only to rest on God's providence."
So they had absolutely nothing.
Nothing, and he puts it in context. He mentions another story, a Spanish account of suffering for 5 days with just a little grain.
And he's saying theirs was worse.
Much worse. He says they often went without food, not for 5 days, but for 2 or 3 months together, and neither had bread nor any kind of cum. For them, just getting some Indian corn was, in his words, as good as a feast.
Now, you'd think this was just a resource problem. New land, don't know how to farm it yet. But the sources insist the failure was structural.
It was entirely structural. This is the core of it. They were operating under what they called the common course.
The common course, so a communal system.
Exactly. Everything was pooled. And Bradford says this approach, which they tried for sundry years, bred much confusion and discontent. And what's so fascinating is that it failed even among, as he calls them, godly and sober men.
And he lists the specific complaints, which feels so you.
They really do. The young men, the able-bodied ones, they did repine, that they had to work hard for other people's wives and children without any recompense.
So the strong and capable got the exact same share as the weak.
Right, which was universally thought injustice. And the older men, the graver men, they felt it was an indignity to be ranked and equalized with the younger guys. It just rubbed everyone the wrong way.
I think the most stunning detail for me was the impact on the family unit.
Oh, it's incredible. Bradford records that the women felt it was a kind of slavery to be ordered to cook and wash clothes for other men.
And their husbands couldn't well broke it.
No, so this communal system, it wasn't building community, it was actually destroying mutual respect.
So this crisis of famine and discontent, it finally comes to a head in the spring of 1623.
It does. They knew they couldn't go on like this. So the governor, after, Bradford says, much debate, he allows a radical change.
What was it?
They abandoned the communal farm. The new rule was simple. Set come every man for his own particular.
Every man for himself.
Or for his own family, yeah. Trusting to themselves.
And that might sound like a small bureaucratic change, but the effect was
What?
immediate.
Immediate and unbelievably positive. The governor gave each family a plot of land based on their size, just for their own use that year. And he says the policy had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious.
And this is where that detail about the women comes in.
Yes, it's the clearest proof. Bradford writes that the women now went willingly into ye field, even taking their little ones.
Whereas before,
Before, under the communal system, they would allege weakness and inability. But the second, their own family's survival depended directly on their labor. That willingness just appeared overnight.
so what were the results that fall?
Total transformation. Instead of famine, God gave them plenty. He says everyone had pretty well to bring ye year about, and the more industrious families actually had a surplus. They had enough to spare and sell to others.
So it's a clear pivot point.
It's definitive.
Hmm.
And Bradford makes a statement that is just. It's incredible. He says that since they made that change, any general want or famine hath not been amongst them since to this day.
And he was writing that in 1647.
Exactly. So you see this perfect experiment. 3 years of terrible starvation, followed by decades of plenty. And the only variable that changed was this one policy, the move to individual initiative.
So if Thanksgiving is about gratitude, this analysis suggests it's not just for the food, but for figuring something out.
It's gratitude for grasping a principle. Each individual is entitled to the fruits of his own labor. That's the core argument. The idea that property rights are basically inseparable from human rights.
And they didn't stop there. They refined the idea a year later in 1624.
They did. This is a crucial next step. They asked the governor for their land for continuance, not just a temporary yearly plot.
Why was that so important?
Well, the industrious settlers pointed out, why would I work really hard to improve my land, clear rocks, enrich the soil, if next year someone else might get it and enjoy the fruits of my labor?
Right, the incentive to invest long-term disappears.
Exactly. So the governor granted it. Each person got an acre of land for them and their heirs until the original contract with their London financiers expired.
And that reinforced the whole system.
And by 1626, you can see the economic results. They have plenty of corn, enough to trade. Bradford mentions sending a boatload of their surplus up the Kennebec River.
And what did they trade it for?
For 700 ties of beaver, besides some other furs, they had become a productive trading economy. And this tiny idea, this seminal principle, as Edmund Burke would later call it, well, you can draw a straight line from that to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
Okay, so now that we've established that principle, individual ownership fueling prosperity, the author, Prentice Jr., he uses this to ask a much bigger, more challenging question.
He does. He asks if that lesson about communal farming really ended in Plymouth in 1623.
And to make that point, he looks at what was happening elsewhere. This wasn't just a Plymouth problem.
No, not at all. Farming in common was the norm in England for another 100 years after the Pilgrims abandoned it.
With terrible results.
Devastating results. The source cites an English writer, even as late as 1844, saying a third of the UK population was basically starving on just potatoes.
So the system that failed in Plymouth was failing on a massive scale elsewhere.
Right. Which leads Prentice to his thought experiment. He asks, what if the Pilgrims had received, foreign aid? What if ships full of food had just shown up during those first starving years?
Would they have ever made the change?
His argument is no. They might have just continued the communal practice, trapped in a cycle of dependency, which he says aligns with the Marxian philosophy of from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
Okay, and this leads directly to the source's modern critique, which we should be clear is the author's viewpoint, not ours.
Absolutely. Prentice argues that aid sent to socialist governments or any system that denies private property is like, and this is his famous quote, attempting to fill a bathtub without first putting the stopper in.
Meaning you're just masking the underlying structural problem.
That's his claim. And he uses some big numbers to make his point, citing $60 billion in foreign aid since World War II. A figure he says was equal to the property value of America's 17 biggest cities at the time.
His point being that money alone can't fix a flawed economic model.
And then he turns that critique inward. He argues that America, in his time, was reenacting the Pilgrims' original mistake, but on a massive national scale.
Okay, how does he make that connection? How do you get from a tiny village farm to modern tax policy?
Well, his argument is that a tax structure aimed at wealth redistribution, rather than just funding a limited government, basically recreates the same dynamic.
The same injustice.
That's his point. that the strong and industrious feel their labor is being taken for others' benefit without any recompense, just like those young Pilgrim men.
And he also points to the growth of government bureaucracy.
He does. He calls them armies of government bureaucrats
Mhm.
devouring our substance like a plague of locusts. A bit dramatic, but
He backs it with a statistic.
yeah, that at the time, 1 in every 6 employed Americans was on a government payroll. He sees the productive sector as being forced to support this ever-expanding administrative state.
The source also goes after government-run businesses.
Right, arguing that when government, which he says controlled about 20% of U.S. industrial capacity, competes with private, tax-paying businesses while being tax-free itself, it creates a fundamentally unfair market.
So ultimately, the whole analysis comes back down to a question of individual responsibility.
It does. It's a very pointed conclusion. He argues that accepting a government handout is, in his view, effectively stealing from the surplus others create.
On the flip side,
On the flip side, producing less than enough to earn a profit contributes to unemployment and higher costs for everyone. It's a stark argument, but it's rooted entirely in that moment, in 1623.
so the key takeaway here from Bradford's history and the analysis of it is really a lesson in cause and effect.
It really is. The shift from near death to abundance in Plymouth was a direct result of moving from communal ownership
Which created resentment and famine.
to a system of individual incentive and property rights.
The source material pretty much urges us to remember that this Thanksgiving, to dedicate ourselves to planting for our own particular.
Right, to renew that ideal of individual freedom and responsibility, and to remember those 3 kernels of corn, not just as a symbol of hunger, but as a symbol of the turning point toward economic liberty.
And as we wrap up, here's a provocative thought for you to consider, pulled directly from this history. Bradford was very clear that this communal system failed, even among godly and sober men who all shared the green goals.
Right.
So the question is the failure of that kind of system an immutable reflection of human nature, that we simply require a personal stake in our own work to be productive, or is it just a flawed organizational structure that would fail no matter how moral the people in it were? That's the debate this history leaves us with.